Welcome to our ReadTech webinar, Understanding REMS in SPL. And thank you all for joining us today. So I do want to introduce you to our presenters today. With me today, we have Gary Zehner and David Wilson, both from ReadTech. Gary is the Senior Manager of Information Solutions at ReadTech. He is a subject matter expert on pharmaceutical structured product labeling and other structured content reporting to regulatory agencies and commercial organizations. Gary also serves as the co-chair of the industry's structured product labeling technical team. We also have David Wilson, our senior account executive on the life sciences team at ReadTech. David assists pharmaceutical companies in achieving compliance through innovative technologies. Gary and David, we are happy to have you both here presenting today.
Thanks, Erin, and welcome.
Yes, thank you so much, Erin. I think we have a pretty big agenda for today, David, so let's get started working our way through this particular topic on REMS, Risk Evaluation and Mitigation Strategy. And then, Erin, if you want to keep an eye on the questions that come on, and we'll reserve some time at the end for question and answers, and you could also help us on poll questions. That would be great. All right, so I thought what we'll do here is take a look at FDA REMS, get an overview for just REMS in general. I'm not sure where the audience is on this particular topic. Maybe they need a little bit of a refresher. We'll just do a recap. I don't want to bore those that are working with the REMS for the last 5 years or so they can certainly get this section of the presentation. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through that. If you feel like you're lost or the acronyms are just piling up and it's just way too busy, please give us a call. Erin and David, myself, and others would be able to work your way through it. And with that, let's get rolling. After we do the overview, we'll jump into taking the REMS content and look at the FDA's initiative to convert that to an XML format. So using their standard structured product labeling, SPL standard, as a vehicle to report that information. We have some suggestions for an implementation plan that you might want to consider, and 5 basic steps there to work your way through collecting a team and resources and eventually making submissions. And then I'm going to leave the last section there for David to be the primary speaker and talk us through some of the solution sets and attributes, capabilities that we have here at ReadTech to help you out. We're going to be a little bit interactive as we work our way through. So, David, let's get rolling.
Sounds great.
All right, so a quick overview, recap of what REMS is. Not too creative here, but I went to the FDA website and decided to borrow their particular definition. So we have a drug safety program that the US FDA can require for certain medications with serious safety concerns to help ensure the benefits of the medication outweigh the risks. So basically, these are drugs that are kind of on the borderline. They have some very desirable benefits, and yet they also have some undesirable risk. So the idea of the REMS program is to evaluate what those risks are and then monitor them or manage them or somehow diminish the effect of those risks and those adverse events by way of various elements, and we'll talk more about that. So part of those elements would be educating the user, making sure there's various procedures and policies in place. So we'll use this as our working definition. When you approach REMS, you really want to be aware and build your strategy based on all those touch points, all the way from the sponsor and the manufacturer through the distributors, dispensers, prescribers, and so on, all the way down to the patient. So anyone that has a touch point is in consideration as you try to evaluate where the risks are and how to mitigate them. So trying to put a plan together would be it's definitely good to follow some of the FDA recommendations. There's a number of guidances out there, but basically they do ask you to focus in on some of those risks, build some goals around either totally eliminating them or minimizing them, and then build various components and then do an assessment to see how you're going. And then there's tons of materials that need to be collected. We won't go into all those on the list there, but they are focused in on some of the materials that you'll need to collect, documents and procedures and various screenings and so on. It can be pretty heavy on if you need to implement all those. On one side of the REMS, that is very heavy with a lot of these elements to assure safe use. There is one REMS completely on the low side, and all it does have is a med guide. So it's one of the more simpler ones, but you do want to be aware that there's a lot of materials that potentially could be involved. And then there's some supporting documents. This is a term the FDA uses to collect those background and other types of documents that you might have to help explain your approach and your rationale in putting the REMS together.
Yeah, so Gary, I have a quick question and just wanted to touch on one additional item. RETech, we do work with a lot of organizations in the life sciences industry. First thing to keep in mind, REMS is primarily for human prescription drugs, right? ANDAs, NDAs, BLAs. So if you've arrived here in the OTC market, this might not necessarily apply to you. However, hey, great opportunity to learn more. But the main question I had for you, Gary, was when FDA wrapped up the pilot program, so post-pilot of the REMS and SPL, they had provided a presentation to regarding REMS and SPL format, and they detailed a concept of capturing the 4 W's of REMS. In our approach that we've detailed here, how do those components you're detailing fit into the 4 W's?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, and the who, one of those W's, would be those stakeholders at the top. When you do something, when that person has to do something, would be covered in the plan. So sometimes you do it before you administer the drug. So you might have to do some education. You might be required to do a particular activity while, during, or even afterwards. So you might have to check for any adverse events or, skin swelling up or whatever. So that would be the when. So who, when, what points to those materials. And the plan about how you go about exercising some of those activities. So who, what, when, and the third one or the fourth one in there is with what materials. So we do have all those REM materials laid out there. I'm going to come back to that answer, David, a little bit later. There is some XML tags that actually focus in on those particular 4 W's. So keep that in mind. If I don't cover it, bring it back up again, all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. We're going to now take a look at the life cycle. So with those that already have REMS, this should look very familiar. Basically, you make sure that your drug has to have a REMS. So usually the FDA determines that. You can actually volunteer to have your product have a REMS program, but usually the FDA determines that it's necessary. There's some guidance there about what they look at to make that decision. But then you go through the developing, approving it, implementing it, having all the stakeholders adopt it and get things up and running. And then you need to assess it. So it might be a 6-month, 12-month, and then annually thereafter type of schedule. But there is at least a period or a schedule that calls for 18 months, 3 years, and 7 years. So those timelines would definitely be assessment points, and then you need to report that particular effectiveness. So that's part of your program is putting some metrics in place and having them be measurable, so that over the course of time you can show either progress or an area that needs to be worked on. And then there's the maintenance. You are able to make revisions and modifications to your REMS. There are possibilities of FDA inspections, and be aware of that. Could generate a 483 warning letter or worse. But there's also the possibility the FDA would look at your progress and your effectiveness in your particular strategy and say, hey, this is working out pretty good, and we can cut back on some of these, or maybe even REMS altogether. So after 3 years, that is a possibility. Now, one thing that most of you and David and I have been looking at the active REMS that are already posted, and many of them are updated since the 2017 October time at the top here. And that is a significant date because it is that point in time that the FDA rolled out a new template and guidance about how you organize your information. Before that, there was a lot of randomness and not structured information. It wasn't very uniform. And there was feedback to the FDA that they wanted to, industry wanted to see a little bit more structured information. And they put together this document, and you can access it through that link and so on. But it does organize the contents into like 5 different sections here. The first one being administrative information, goals that we talked about. And then there's REMS requirements. And the first section is for those participants that have requirements. That could be any one of those prescribers or patients or anywhere in the logistic chain. There's a couple areas that need to be explicitly addressed. The second half of the document continues with the applicant requirements. And again, there's some predefined sections there. The last 2 sections have to do with the assessment timetable. And, that we talked a little bit about that already, but how often you do an assessment and evaluate. And then the last section is a list of those materials. Now, the materials are not actually in this document. They are held separately as a separate PDF file. But there's definitely, some association going on between the REMS document and the actual supporting files. A couple quick facts here. David had mentioned this is for prescription drugs and biologics, no OTCs. You're able to make some changes. A couple of different supplements are able to be submitted. I want to call attention to the bottom 2 here. There's a number of REMS that are single REMS, meaning there's a single sponsor. Now, that could have multiple products in that particular REMS, but most importantly, it's a single sponsor, and that is carved out and referred to as differently from a shared system REMS. So a shared REMS, by definition, will have multiple sponsors, so multiple manufacturers typically would be involved, and obviously there's multiple products. We use the term here inside RETEC a basic REMS, and that would be a REMS with no elements to assure safe use, and then all the others would have the elements to assure safe use. And we'll take a look at some metrics here in a moment. This is the website that David and Aaron and I have been poking around with recently, keeping an eye on. You can go there. It does show all the published REMS and a number of attributes. You can download a number of bits of information into an Excel file, or actually download it into a database file. All right, so these are the stats of those REMS that are on and published on the website. So just to finalize what we see here, the upper row of information is from 5 years ago, 2016. And the lower row was just updated recently, last few days here, 2021 values. So just a couple takeaways. currently 60 REMS, and that's actually down from 5 years ago, 75 total 5 years ago. But it appears as though the complexity has gone up of those that are currently published on this website. So there's significantly more REMS with ETASU than in 2016, and the shared REMS have been increasing. So the idea of a single basic REMS is going down, and there's certainly more complexity here over the course of time, and we kind of expected that sort of issue. Now, let's do a quick look at the timeline. This is the REMS, the basic REMS, and I promise we'll start talking SPL here momentarily. Noteworthy on this screen is the date starting around 2011 and 2017, and that is when the FDA started this integration initiative. Lasted for a while, 6 years, but they did do a REMS pilot, and this is what David was referring to. 2015, 2016, we participated in this REMS pilot and had some good takeaways we'll share in a moment. And then 2017, a whole host of documents. By the way, in the end of this presentation, we list out a lot of these FDA guidance documents and provide links for you. And you'll see a lot of them were generated at the end of this integration initiative. So they listened to industry, made some decisions, rolled out a number of new guidances, new template, and at the same time put a draft guidance document together for REMS SPL. And then it went silent. Nothing. Next year, nothing. So we'll talk a little bit later about what happened here. But with that break, let's start talking specifically about SPL, structured product labeling, as a tool to capture REMS. Why did they consider SPL? And this is pretty much the same reason that the FDA considered SPL for listing and labeling and establishment registration and the other 50 documents that they have in place for SPL. It's basically, the FDA is not very friendly for use in downstream users, either by computer or for human use. Number of other considerations, but for time reasons, we'll move on. There is a number of benefits that the FDA hopes to have by putting REMS into SPL. It's a lot easier to understand, more accessible, fits into the healthcare process a lot better. It actually is easier, more structured for the FDA review when they have a very fixed, organized, and structured layout of REMS, and can use SPL tools and computer tools. There is more information, and we'll talk about those particular segments that are captured in an SPL REMS. So there's a participant summary, which we're going to talk about, which is coded and also available in narrative format. And then there's the drug product element. So those that have been working with SPL for listing are aware of the metadata codes. Not many here, but they're being added with SPL. There are an existing platform that is able to be built upon. So using existing standards and infrastructure, many at the FDA are familiar with SPL. And the bottom line is all of this was to improve the patient safety. And with that, finally, the FDA published a final guidance. So you look at the dates up there, 2017, the draft came out, it was about October. And then it was a couple days late for a Christmas present, but certainly good for a New Year's present, 2020. The final guidance came out, and you see the timeline below, the number of years went by where you could technically submit voluntarily, but everyone was kind of on the back shelf waiting for the final guidance to come out. Now, there is a 2-year period of time built into this guidance document. So 2 years after it's published, the deadline is enforced, and that is quite unusual for a guidance. As you know, guidances usually have recommended information. It's like it's not really enforceable legally, and you can protest and ask for a different type of accommodation, not frequently given, by the way, but guidances usually don't have a binding attribute to them. This one does. So FADA, the FDA Amendments Act a number of years ago, had given the FDA rights to enforce electronic submissions 2 years after a publication of the final draft, final publication of the guidance for industry. So they enacted that option for this particular electronic submission. So in this particular case, REMS SPL would be required for new and modified REMS as of 2022, December 28th. So we have this 2-year grace period or transition period, I really should say, that you can voluntarily submit REMS SPL. And let's get into some of those details. When you build an SPL, there are some things that you're able to reuse, but there's also some new bits of information. So just like you had to capture some metadata when you had to go about the task of creating an SPL for a drug label, there are a couple elements here in the beginning, header information, I refer to them. They're very much like the header fields in SPL labeling. The one that I'll call out here is the SPL labeling set ID for the labeling document. So rather than repeating a lot of information about the drug product, SPL REMS simply has a link over to the SPL listing document that's already been submitted to the FDA. So there is this link that needs to be done, and you simply pick up the set ID and record that information in there. So we can talk about those details later, but that is unique for SPL REMS. It actually has a reference to an external SPL file. There is a few product data elements. Most of these are actually in the REMS. You could probably find them. There's a DUNS number also on this list, probably not in the REMS, but not too complex. The third row there is actually the REMS document. This is that format that we talked about earlier. Has all those sections in it and the requirements. So that's narrative that is simply able to be tagged by XML. It is heavily, it makes heavy use of tables. So that is a little bit of a challenge for those that are not familiar with SPL and working with tables. And then this is the new element, this next to last row in the bottom here, this REMS participant summary table. And what is done there, and we'll take some screenshots here and build upon this in a little bit, but basically the information that is recorded in the narrative in the tables is then repeated in separate codes by using FDA controlled vocabulary. So it actually would appear twice on a rendered view, but most noteworthy is that it has some codes behind the scene that computers can use. So the FDA is very much interested in exposing this information and making it available. The last item here is the REMS materials. No change there. You've already been collecting those type of things.
And Gary, quick question on these items. For anyone attending who may have been participated in the REMS pilot or had experience with that, or even seen any of the SPL files that were created in that time frame, there was time spent on the concept of a REMS summary. The FDA even said, "Hey, contact us. We'll help you write the REMS summary." Previous webinars, we received questions about the REMS summary. Can you explain kind of fundamentally what has happened to the REMS summary and how this new process is making that part of the SPL, I'd say?
Yeah, you remember, David, this was actually one of the biggest challenge, I think, during the pilot, is taking a regular narrative REMS and putting it into a table, format. And then on top of that, once you finally had done that, you captured the information that was in the narrative in the second summary, REMS summary is what it was. It was dedicated REMS summary section. And there was a lot of terms and codes that were connected with capturing that. So that two-step process was very difficult. What we have now is, for the most part, the owners and sponsors of REMS have migrated into a structured 2017 template. And that is probably 70% of the load of migrating into that organized fashion. And then the participant summary section, those requirements have additional coding. We're going to take a look at those graphically, but that still exists, putting that information into a summary, another type of table that gets rendered by the style sheet. And it is probably going to be a little bit of a challenge. So this is where you definitely want SPL person to come into play. Let's do a quick poll, and then we'll touch back on that if we didn't fully answer that, David, okay? Aaron, are you able to run a poll question for us?
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary. Okay. So I will give everyone about 30 seconds to answer the poll, but we're hoping to find out how involved have you been in SPL so far? Choices: I prepare FDA SPL documents. I am knowledgeable but not directly involved. I am aware but I'm not knowledgeable. And finally, I have not heard of FDA SPL. So it looks like
that should be no one, because we just talked about it. But I understand the acronyms drives everybody crazy.
Too late, Gary. I already answered. I have not heard of it. Sorry.
Okay, yeah.
I was going to say we have 60% of the vote in, and I can tell you that some people still have not heard of FDA SPL.
Okay, all right. Well, that's another webinar, Aaron. That's another webinar.
All right. So that's been about a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and show everyone the results. Okay. So it looks like we had about 27% that actually prepared the FDA SPL documents. Equally 27% that are knowledgeable but not directly involved. The biggest bucket is 30% of our attendees are aware of SPL but aren't necessarily knowledgeable about it. Hopefully they will be by the end of this presentation. And then finally 17% that have not heard of SPL.
And thanks, Aaron, because this is great to really understand the audience. Gary lives, eats, and breathes SPL, so we sometimes take for granted the knowledge we have. So I think the next couple sections here will really help kind of detail how an organization can really align themselves to be prepared for this mandate.
Yeah, and David, I think you talk to a lot of customers as well. Do you find that those people that are responsible for REMS, since they really never had to put it in SPL before, maybe this is a new concept? You think that's where it's coming from?
It's a good point, Gary. And a lot of times when we're speaking to, many times we're looking and speaking with cross-functional groups, whether it be the people preparing labeling documents, labeling context, the content, preparing the artwork, or CMC folks that are working on data to prepare for like an electronic lot distribution report. But it's when FDA kind of shifts into this new process of, hey, we're going to use this standard because it works great, where it's an opportunity for now these folks that may have been experts in their space to start learning more about the structured content. So it almost happens every time there's a new process that's outside of the electronic drug registration and listing process, where it's introducing something brand new, a new standard to an expert. Yeah,
this is throwing an SPL curve to all those regulatory people that would only be connected, with REMS in the past and other regulatory items. We're going to talk about that because, they're an important part of the team. On the other side of it, you need some XML expertise to be part of your team. So let's take a look at some steps here. And that was actually a pretty nice transition into assembling a team, preparing the team in the process, authoring REMS, building the REMS, and then submitting the REMS. So we're going to take a step or look at each of these 5 steps with a little bit more detail.
Yeah, and if you could back up one moment, Gary, to that last slide, you could even think of it here as, we may be in this kind of 1, maybe 2 today, with the arrow pointing being, okay, by December 2022, we got to have this done. So there is time. So that's a great thing. And but we'll talk a little bit more about the time, and especially in this the scenario we find ourselves in with health emergency, and time seems to stand still and fly by at the same time. So before you know it, 2022 will be upon us.
Right. I do want to convey the concepts in each of these 5 steps. They could be developed pretty much on their own, but so I'm going to be a little bit light in going through some of the details and leave some of these slides with more detailed as homework for you, if you don't mind. And then please get back to us if you have questions. The first one there is assemble the team. And as we were mentioning, it really does need to be a team of different disciplines. So at least 2, perhaps 3 different disciplines need to be on and represented in the team. So having someone that is very familiar with your drug product is paramount. That's a prerequisite. So that person might know the product inside and out, and might also be aware of the regulations, but maybe not necessarily. So it might be 2 people here to cover these particular disciplines, know the drug product and know the regulations, and be familiar with perhaps another REMS that was put together, or it is familiar and has some context on how you build a REMS plan. So there's a lot of different topics that need to come into play here. The other area of expertise that definitely needs to be on the team is someone that's familiar with SPL and XML coding. So I don't care how that gets done, whether you have an internal person that is able to fulfill that role, whether it's an external person, it might be a consultant, it might be read tech. This happens to be our core expertise. But I assure you, some way, hook or by crook, you ought to have this SPL expert on your team. And this was one of the takeaways that the FDA logged as a result of their pilot. And so this is not just RETEC talking here, by the way. It really was a combined effort, and there has to be some interaction. So sometimes a regulatory person needs to define a particular option and description, but they have to use certain XML controlled vocabulary terms. So these people need to talk to each other. So make sure those are represented on your team. That's point 1, assembling the team.
Yeah, and I'll expand there, Gary. You could even look at who might be managing the regulatory information, right? Is it IT, right? How are we ensuring change management within these documents? Where are these documents being housed? And it's not something that specific expert or the REMS expert, the SPL expert may always know, especially if you're coming to us because or you found this webinar because you are expecting FDA to say, yeah, you need a REMS program, right? And you haven't started compiling that yet. There's a lot of different working components, but one, as Gary mentioned, assembling that team and the next step of preparing the team will lead you to that success in preparing this.
Right. So let's hit the second step. One is making sure that REMS is actually required. There's a number of guidance documents and resources available to do a little bit of homework, and you can guide. We can help you work your way through that. And and then identify the REMS requirements that need to go in that REMS document that we looked at earlier. So there's a number of sections, and you can kind of start organizing your task by how you're going to fill out those particular sections. And this, by the way, a strategy here, once you've documented it, there's some heavy infrastructure in IT that might go alongside of that and to back it up. So you might actually have to build a website or a repository to support this REMS strategy. So this is really just kind of the tip of the iceberg, but you'll definitely need to do some homework here and find out where you're going, what you need to do, and then establish this SPL process. How are you going to build this SPL document? You're going to have an in-house tool. You're going to build something. You're going to code it yourself. You're going to use an expert that's been doing this for a while. You need to have a solution in place, and we can help you out there for sure. All right. So then the task moves over to the actual grunt work. Let's author this XML. This REMS content. So pulling together some of that header information we talked about, pulling together the product data information. The REMS document is most likely already created. I hope that you had used the 2017 table-based template, because that will make your life so much easier if you have done that already. If not, that becomes a prerequisite before moving forward into SPL. And then there's this topic of participant summaries, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. REMS materials, you're probably familiar with those, collecting them. These are the training sheets, the checklists, the information pamphlets, and so on. And then keeping some supporting documents. Now, these are, again, the REMS background information. These are not, although they are submitted, the FDA does not publicize these. They do not publish the REMS supporting documents that you submit. It's really for their education, understand, and realize how you had come to this particular plan. Now, I want to focus in on this participant summary topic a little bit. So if you look in the upper screen, this is a section of that 2017 REMS document that we had. So many of you, if you've already prepared that, this will look very familiar. This is one of the sections for the participant requirements. And I've used this example off the website, so public information here. But you will have, in this case, 1, 2, 3, 4 particular requirements, sub-requirements that are connected with this particular activity. Each one of those is also represented in the table below. And for that to happen, you would need to associate each one of those with a couple different elements. So you'd have to pick an activity, when, so this is before, during, or after the actual administration of the product. Who is the stakeholder? Is this the patient? Is this the individual dispensing? There's a couple different pick list items for each of these categories, and then what is the requirement? And there may be a document supporting this particular activity, or not. There is not always a requirement there. But for these particular items to be generated, this is where you do need to work with the XML person, to the SPL person, to understand which items are available. Now, ideally, when this narrative was written, these particular terms were held in mind, and they are now very easily associated, but who knows how that could happen. It may not be real clear. So some of these are pretty obvious. I see receive consulting, from the prescriber, blah, blah, blah. Number 3, receive consulting is actually one of the pick list items that the FDA makes available. So there it was pretty straightforward, but sometimes it's not quite so easy. So keep that in mind, that this is a task that we're talking about that might take interaction, collaboration between someone that really knows what's the activity and the requirement, and can then work with the actual available terms. So does that make sense, David? I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but this might be a little bit more graphic.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, that absolutely makes sense. And seeing it visually definitely helps decipher it. And then in the other pieces, we have even heard, while that REMS summary isn't necessarily a part of this now, the FDA is willing to assist and even kind of review in some of this. So they have stated that in the past, and they kind of echoed that recently. Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, so this rendered view is adjacent. So right after the requirement, so the section 2 here, you would see this table, and then you go to section 3, and there would be a corresponding table, section 4, and so on. That is not the way it was done originally when it was first rolled out. There was a separate REMS summary section all by itself, and this kind of had to be created, and there was no nice tight association. But I do like the way this is presented. It's a little bit clearer. These links are live, by the way, in the rendered view. If you click on enroll in REMS, it'll jump right back up here to the particular item in the table above. And like similar fashion, the links to the documents would actually open to PDF files. All right. So now we're ready to build the SPL. We kind of have all the information collected, and I won't go through the gory details here, but you code the XML, you write the header, the documents, the narrative. You build this participant summary, and again, that's probably the one that's going to take a little bit more attention, a little bit of a challenge for those that are not familiar with tables, and then you do a schema check, make sure everything's right. You check the data validation, and now you are finally to the point where you're ready to submit. Now, one thing I wanted to mention here, and as part of any XML, SPL, David, there's at least one slide where we have this ugly XML, but you were talking about the 4 W's before, who, what, when, and with what. There's actually codes in the summary that we were just talking about, in the participant summary, that are associated with these particular terms. So this is how computers are able to decipher what we just saw visually. There's actually a lot of codes. Now we see this in a real nice, easily understood, human readable version down below here, but computers just absolutely love this gory text on the left. All right, so now we're ready to submit. David, there are a couple different, and we've kicked this around a number of times. One way is you might have built an SPL for an existing approved REMS, and you took it on your own volition, and you stepped out and you said, okay, I'm going to take this existing content and just put it into REMS and not change anything. So the FDA does certainly allow that. You want to let them know that you're walking down that particular pathway. So there's an email link there, and then you're able to submit that to the Office of the Commissioner, and you put those particular files. Now you have an XML file, and you have one or more PDF file, or none perhaps, 0 to many PDF files, all together in the same folder, and you get to name that, and then you send it off through the electronic submission gateway. This is the way it was done, and I believe that's the way it's going to continue to be done. We're going to be confirming that with the FDA, but this was the instruction that we had previously. Now, when you create your SPL, you might change some content, or it's for a brand new REMS and it's never been approved yet. So in that case, the FDA wants to review it. So just like those people that are familiar with the SPL labeling, you need to send a version in along with a Word document for negotiation, and you send your initial version in, and you do it the same way. Here you use the ECTD as the vehicle, and you place the Word document and the REMS XML file and PDF in these particular subfolders in the ECTD structure, and you make a submission, a supplement to in this case CDER or CBER, not the Office of the Commissioner, and then go back and forth using marked up Word. Once that's done, now you submit the final. You make any updates that were agreed to. You have 14 days to do that, and then submit it off back in with the final version of the ECTD, and then make a parallel submission. And this is very much like drug listing, by the way. You make a parallel submission to the Office of the Commissioner. That particular version as it is to be used for publicizing up on the FDA REMS website and to the Daily Med. There's one little nuance. There's a third method we need to talk about. We talked earlier about shared REMS. So now you might have 10 different manufacturers all working together. There's actually guidance about how this is supposed to happen, but they've obviously done this in the past. So, there's a number of shared REMS out there, but now they need to agree on the SPL, the creation of it, and the submission of it. So sending that in, I definitely want to talk to the FDA to make sure the actual procedures. We believe, well, this was the information that we received previously, that you would have a boilerplate SPL that's the same, like 98% the same for all those 10 individual manufacturers. But remember that metadata that we were talking about, where it had the manufacturer's name, and it might have a different BLA or a company's NDA. It could all be a little bit different in the metadata. So technically the SPLs are not identical, and we believe that 10 SPLs would need to be submitted, one for each of those little nuances. The FDA has defined an index file to actually bring these together and associate them on the National Library of Medicine website. So it'll be interesting to see how these are fleshed out. There are no shared REMS published to the National Library as of yet, but those are the three different methods. No change, very straightforward. You submit an SPL. Secondly, when you do have a change or it's brand new. And then the third one is a special case scenario where you have a shared REMS. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And like Gary had mentioned, these are things we've requested clarity and are looking to help provide that guidance once we do understand a little bit more, whether through a blog post or outreach to those of you who are attending. Because this is, as Gary had mentioned, one would think, since those metadata fields include specific information for your product set ID, how can that one then represent many? Especially in some of the scenarios like the shared REMS for opioids, where there's not only multiple sponsors, but then also multiple products that are listed in that shared REMS. So it'll be interesting to see. But the good news is that we have till December 2022 to get it all figured out.
Right. I just happened to look at the time. Oh my gosh, we have like 10 minutes. So I'm going to move on. I think I alluded to this data flow. SPLs are submitted to the FDA. One copy sent off and published at REMS at FDA. The other goes to the National Library of Medicine. You can currently go to the Daily Med and follow the link in the bottom right here, and then the red arrow will point to a little dialog box, and you can see small print there, 3 current files. You can download the zip file and take a look at them. And that brings us to poll number 2. Aaron,
All right, so I am going to launch our second poll right now. So after going through all of the options with Gary, thank you. We wanted to know, how will you create your SPL document? Would you build a software, buy software, use an external vendor, use RETech, use a different external vendor other than RETech, or make manual FDA submissions? Assuming that is allowed, I know that there may still be some question around that, Gary, if I'm correct.
Yeah, last Dave and I checked, the X forms, for example, was able to be used for the SPL REMS. So I think that is what you're referring to as the last item there, an FDA solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Right.
All right, we will give just a few more seconds. I don't want to take too much time. All right. So with that, I'm going to close this poll and share the results. Okay, it looks like we had 6% build, 6% buy, 50% planning on using RETech, 31% planning on using a different external vendor, and 6% planning on using the manual FDA submission option.
All right, very good. David, let's do this last section here. How can you help us get this SPL created?
Great. Well, I can help wrap it up quite simply. For those of you who are using us, and have familiarity with RETech in the past, it's very similar to what you're doing today, whether it's for your lot distribution reporting, your electronic drug registration and listing services. We work with our clients with data collection forms, your core data that you're providing to us to code into XML, SPL, and you communicate that to us, whether it's through a secure VPN channel, email, or our single source for drug products. From there, we go about the process of building the file, validating the data, and communicating it back to you. We'll provide a conversion report with each and every SPL file we build so that you can review any potential warnings or issues with the file, and then also review that rendered SPL file to bless it. And whether it be submit directly to the OC, or as Gary had mentioned, still that clarity we're looking to get from FDA, also in that ECTD submission. Right to FDA. So yeah, that's the general process here visually. We tend to try to be as a seamless part of your regulatory process by simply saying, hey, send us your data, and depending on the urgency, X number of days, you'll have that data back to be able to review it and submit to FDA. All right, Gary, any questions or next slide?
Yeah, I do have a question on this one. We talked earlier about some of the difficulties. It's brand new to a number of people. XPL might be brand new to a lot of people. So can you share how RETech helps bring those companies along and make a successful submission?
Yeah. So ultimately, with everything we do, RETech, we've over 50 members on our life sciences team. Dedicated client success team. We really hold your hand through the process, whether it's through training you on the data elements, or that initial review of the documentation you're providing, ensuring each of the components based on that basic REMS SPL or the REMS SPL that may include the ETASU, ensuring that all the components are there that are required, and really helping you through that. It's almost as if we assist through that crafting of the process of the building of that SOP for this specific process. So that's really how we try to make it as seamless as a process as we can. So yeah, what we're viewing here is essentially an overview of our data collection form, and then the information that you would need to provide to us outside of then the core documents you would provide. So the drug metadata, or the data elements of these files, are typically the core that's being validated by FDA, much like with drug listings, facility registrations, and so forth. So we try to make it as easy as possible with drop-down menus, information that can be reused over time by our clients. And ultimately, these forms can also be used to control versioning within an organization.
There we go.
Great, and what we're viewing here, like Gary kind of showed a little bit earlier, is the, to the very left, that XML view, which we live in, but no one really wants to see. The middle there would be the human view of the narrative, along with then the human view of the metadata of the file. So these are really critical in reviewing, doing final analysis, final QC. Is this everything that we asked for? And as you'll see right at the bottom of the metadata there, under labeler related label set ID, that's where Gary and I have kind of been like, well, how's this going to work? We're really waiting and anticipating FDA's response to that regarding those shared REMS.
Yeah, and this is nowhere near as comprehensive as what you see in a drug listing, but there is some metadata that needs to be completed there. Mm-hmm. So what's next here, David? How do I comply? Yeah.
So ultimately, I think the most difficult part is getting the team started, right? Ensuring that we're meeting those timelines, right? We're constantly pulled in many different ways, and trying to ensure that we have the core team we need to get this process, get this new process started and really validated is one of the most important processes. So we always try to stress on the early adoption of this, right? Really ensure that you're getting the processes started to ensure that you're not in that late panic mode if you try to do it, start looking at it around Christmas time of 2022. The other thing is, like I said earlier, the FDA has expressed their willingness to assist with some of this and in providing feedback and ensuring that the information is buttoned up and what they're looking for. The other thing I'll point out here is that watch for our future updates and future REMS guidance. As we learn more, we'll share that with our friends in industry and our clients and everyone who's attended here today. And then last thought here is we can help, right? This is what our core expertise is in SPL, right? We help save time. We are proven and compliant. We're the largest volume submitter of SPL data to the FDA. We are cost effective, and we provide a very flexible model with this outsource model. We can create standard or custom work instructions for each of our clients to ensure that we're meeting their needs, and we try to ease the pain through this least intrusive process of being, just send us your data and we'll go about that process. And we really do pride ourselves in that training, customer support, along with kind of 1A, 1B being accurate and timely, so that you can make sure you're meeting your timelines and you're doing so accurately.
Great. So with that, I will launch the third poll, and then we can just wrap it up.
Great.
So the third poll is, when will you be creating your REMS SPL? With the options being early in the voluntary period, late in the voluntary period, or when it is required. So yeah, hopefully, with the suggestion that we just heard from David, we'll get some responses early in the voluntary period. But I will give everyone just a few minutes to go ahead and cast their vote. Or a few seconds, rather, I should say.
Thanks, Erin. And then, as we're waiting for some of the poll results, did we have any questions come in through the chat function?
We did have a few questions, but I was actually going to mention at the end, I think that we can just individually respond to the questions.
Yeah.
There was nothing too overarching, and we are just about out of time.
Yep.
So I'll just pass those questions on to the best person within RETEC, and we'll get back to anyone who answered it directly or who asked it directly.
Great, thanks.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And it looks like we have 11% who are planning early in the voluntary period, 17% planning late in the voluntary period, 72% who are planning on waiting until it is required. So I'm going to go ahead and, all right, Gary, and if you just wanted to move on to the next slide. So here we do have our resources. This is just kind of showing how to get to the resources section on our webpage, which was pretty recently redesigned. So hopefully everyone can find it. But if you just go up to the top navigation bar and sources. We're going to go to the Knowledge Center and then down to drug and biologic product submissions. From there, you'll be able to see the webinar once we post that, but also any blogs, like Dave mentioned, once we get some new information, we'll definitely be sure to share that in the form of blogs or webinars, etc. So this is always a good place to just check in if you have any questions about this, or really any other topic as well. We are also always sharing our content on LinkedIn and Twitter, so be sure to follow us there as well. And Gary, if you could just advance. And then these are just some resources from the FDA. We will be sending this presentation out and the links will be live. So you can certainly just go through and check out any of this if you'd like. And then follow up with us if you do have any questions about it. And then finally, this is how you can get in touch with our RETech Life Sciences team, pharma@readtech.com, or there is our phone number. I know we did go through our services section a little bit quickly. David did a great job of kind of condensing everything for you, but if you had more questions about sort of how we work or anything like that, definitely feel free to reach out and we would give you more information. And then just any general questions about the presentation or SPL, feel free to reach out. So thank you everyone for attending today. Of course, thank you Gary and David for this presentation. I think it was really helpful, and hopefully, we did have some novices with SPL, and I think that hopefully they're feeling a little bit more educated after today. So thank you both.
Great. Thanks, Erin, and thank you for attending.